This episode is brought to you by Sacred Rites, which provides support, resources, and networks for religion scholars committed to translating their research to a broader audience. You can find more information about their work at sacred-rites.org. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Nalika Gajawira to the show. Nalika Gajawira is an anthropologist of Buddhism, race, and ethics with a focus on community well-being and resilience. In this episode, we discuss her research, including her current book manuscript, Transforming the American Sangha, funded by the Katali Foundation. The book is an ethnography of the insight meditation movement in North America, focused on the efforts of practitioners of color to raise awareness of oppressive racial conditions in these communities. Also, her doctoral research examined how Buddhist ethics and practices of giving shaped Sri Lankan local NGOs doing humanitarianism work in the context of two disasters, the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 and ethnic conflict that ended in 2009. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Nalika Gajawira. Dr. Nalika Gajawira, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Nalika Gajawira. I serve as the Assistant Director of the Humanities Center at the University of California, Irvine. Alongside my work there, I'm an independent scholar with a PhD in cultural anthropology, which I actually earned right here at UCI back in 2014. My research is rooted in the anthropology of Buddhism. Broadly speaking, I look at contemporary Buddhism's intersection with race and ethnicity, and power and politics. Most of my fieldwork has focused on how these dynamics play out in very different contexts, specifically in Sri Lanka and right here in the United States. My first project, which was the basis of my dissertation, based on fieldwork in Sri Lanka, focused on local Buddhist humanitarian NGOs, doing work in the context of disaster and the tsunami and the civil war, the 30-year civil war in Sri Lanka. And there I was really interested in seeing how Buddhist ethics and ideas of doing good, notions of karma and merit making intersect with the politics of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka. But more recently, I've shifted my focus to look at Buddhism in the US, specifically looking at what's called Vipassana meditation communities or insight meditation-based convert groups. A lot of other scholars have been doing this similar work, but my focus is specifically looking at the dynamics of race, racism, and whiteness in these spaces through the lens of the experiences of POCs, practitioners of color. And so what connects these projects is I'm really interested in, the common thread is looking at power in Buddhist institutions.
Wonderful. I'd love to know a little bit about your origin in those areas of expertise. How'd you get into Buddhism? How'd you get into anthropology? What's the story there?
Yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate that question. So a little background context to myself. I was born in the United States in Virginia Beach, Virginia. But very early in when I was very young, my dad passed away, and so my family, my mom and my sisters, we moved back to Sri Lanka. So I have this unique experience of being a second generation Asian American or Sri Lankan American, but really born in the US and having most of my formative childhood years growing up in Sri Lanka. And my family is Sinhalese Buddhist. So I grew up in a Buddhist household. I went to my primary education up till fifth grade was in a Buddhist girls' school, which was actually incidentally founded by the Theosophists, who are Americans, in the turn of the century. So all of this didn't. I remember growing up and seeing all these white people on frames in the auditorium and being really curious about who these people were. It's only later in college, reflecting and reading about scholarship of Buddhism and Sri Lanka that I came to learn a lot about what my upbringing was about. But about Buddhism, so as I said, I grew up Buddhist, but I never really had a interest, scholarly interest in Buddhism until much later. Although I did have growing up, I went to temple, I went with my family to, and Sri Lankan Buddhism is very heterodox. There are Hindu practices. My dad took us to St. Jude's Temple, although we were Buddhist. So there's a lot of religious heterodoxy. And then as I was in college, but I would back up and say that also there was a civil war that was unfolding during this entire time in the 80s and the 90s, and between the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tamil Tigers of Elam, the LTTE, and that was a separatist conflict. But there was a lot of religion that was part of that. So Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, one could think about it as white Christian nationalism in similar ways. And so that was kind of the state ideology. And I was myself a Buddhist and didn't really think critically about these questions until in college. I went to Occidental College, so I started a liberal arts education and taking classes on colonialism and post-colonialism in South Asia, reading Edward Said on Edward Orientalism, thinking about otherness and othering, and um, really being informed by anthropological turns in the 80s and 90s around the reflexive turn, anthropology as cultural critique, as interrogating power. And those kinds of questions really got me thinking about Buddhism in more scholarly ways and terms. And that led me in many ways in much of my 20s and 30s to really not identify as a Buddhist. So while, many people in the United States are identifying as Buddhists, I actively was disavowing my Buddhism in a way because I was really did not know how to hold on to think about myself as a Buddhist while at the same time um, thoroughly understanding the implications of it in violence and conflict. And so, but that said, like when I started doing my dissertation work, I was really primarily interested in humanitarianism and international development and local development, NGO work. But this was all happening in the context of Sri Lanka's civil war and seeing how a lot of the ways in which people in these organizations were really informed by their Buddhist upbringing, Buddhist ideas and ideologies about merit and karma and helping and doing good. And so those questions really started making me think in different ways about how Buddhism plays out in everyday life, in socially engaged Buddhist forums, for better and for worse. So I saw those in very different kinds of w ways in which Buddhism plays out.
Wonderful. I'd love to know a little bit about your book project as well. I know you have a project in the works called Transforming the American Sangha. Can you tell me a little bit about the origin story for this particular project?
Yeah, so right out of UCI, I started as a researcher at the University of Southern California, the Center for Religion and Civic Culture. There was a Templeton funded project actually there called Religious Competition and Creative Innovation. That was a project that was in Southern California, and it was a project that was testing the hypothesis that Templeton had that, like in the marketplace, if religious congregations compete with each other, this will result in innovation. And we were looking at that question in the context of Los Angeles. And I, having come from, my research was primarily in Sri Lanka and looking at Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And American Buddhism was actually a very new topic for me, a very unexplored scholarly field for me. But I was interested in the process of doing that project as an anthropologist. I was applying my ethnographic skills to study congregations. I was checking out some of these new mindfulness communities in Los Angeles because mindfulness was like a really big deal at the time. It was on the
Definitely.
cover of the Times Magazine. MBSR was becoming a big there's all these apps that are coming up at the same
Hmm.
time. So, and you have this kind of trend of the religious nuns being talked about in the academy, right? How the spiritual but not religious, how is mindfulness kind of this place in which people are exploring Buddhism but stripped of its religious trappings. And I was interested in these questions of secularization of Buddhism, which has been a conversation and a topic of great interest for many. But that also happened at the same time in which Ferguson happened. And then soon after that, George Floyd and all the other events of police brutality in the United States. And the conversation on racism, police brutality, the history of segregation, all these things are coming into the meditation communities and the mindfulness spaces. And practitioners of color organizing and having sitting groups in which those things that are happening outside are being talked about in their communities. And they're addressing these with their teachers in the wider Sangha with the white teachers and the white practitioners, and really seeing. And that was for me kind of my formative experience, my doing participant observation in those spaces and seeing the debates and the tensions and the ways in which teachers were, some better than others, were addressing these questions, and the organizing that was happening uh, at the same time amongst practitioners of color, looking at the intersections of racialized suffering and how is Buddhism going to address that question, and how is Dharma? How are we thinking about the Dharma? Is there a space in Buddhism's definition of suffering to think about systemic suffering and structural forces? So that is how the project really started about.
How did you narrow in on exactly who you were going to write about and identify that particular community?
Yeah, so as I said, I was looking at mindfulness, and mindfulness really comes from the Vipassana meditation technique. And there is a larger kind of landscape of insight meditation communities across the country. You know, as a side note, actually, I have family members, my sisters, who are insight meditation practitioners as well, and who've been long time participants in these communities. I also started to have conversations to really learn about American Buddhism and Dharma through people like Ann Gleig, who had written a book recently about that. And she was actually really one of these people who helped introduce me to the foundation, the Katali Foundation, that funded my research. And one of the senior advisors there, his name's Larry Yang, and he's actually one of the early leaders in the movement in insight meditation around bringing these conversations around racial justice and inclusion to the insight meditation communities. So in anthropology, we do snowball sampling, where you talk one person, then you talk to another person, and then they introduce you to different communities. They talk to you in their interviews. They're talking to you about who was part of that group, who were they in conversation with. So then I interviewed those people, and that. And then there's also these motherships, in a way, of the inside meditation community in the United States. So those are the places that I went to in the East Coast and the West Coast. And that's how, and then of course in Southern California as well, because that's where I'm based. One of the big things I'm trying to do with this book is shift how we think about Buddhism in the West, but also, in a way, in the contemporary global space, to invite readers to see it not just as a set of teachings, ethical ideas, or even meditation techniques, but as something that actually takes shape in real communities. Buddhist communities aren't just neutral carriers of teachings, but they're places where power is at work. And I think, especially today, with so much emphasis on applying meditation and Buddhist ideas to everyday life, we sometimes forget to ask where those ideas are coming from. They come out of communities that are institutions, places with leadership, authority, and internal debates and power struggles. And so, like any institution, Buddhist institution is shaped by the larger social forces where dynamics like race, gender, nationalism, class really play out. So, this book, I make that concrete by looking at insight meditation communities in the US. I show how, in a deeply racialized society like the United States, race doesn't stay outside of the meditation space, but it internally structures these spaces themselves. In particular, I argue that whiteness often operates as an invisible norm in the ways in which the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, are interpreted, taught, and practiced and experienced. So, what I mean by this is that these communities are often end up centering ways of thinking, speaking, and practicing that reflect the white experience and perspectives. So, what does that look like, and what does that mean for practitioners of color who are coming into these spaces? Particularly when they bring their lived experiences of racial suffering, police brutality, and historical trauma. Um, this can create tensions. And so, what I explore in this book is how their understandings of suffering um, come up against the dominant insight meditation community's historical approach to Buddhism and Dharma, which is framed in many ways as universal and primarily psychological. So, how do we apply meditation in a ways to liberate our individuals' psychological suffering and well-being versus suffering that is structural, historical, and ongoing. Um, so there's kind of, so I'm interested in exploring this paradox that when people come to Buddhism, practitioners of color come to Buddhism seeking liberation, they encounter institutions that are themselves shaped by racial dynamics of exclusion and othering. And well, there's been real progress. So I've been looking at the work that practitioners of color have done over the last 20 to 30 years. And there's a lot of organizing efforts that have happened in these communities in terms of increasing diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, creating safe spaces, sanghas, BIPOC retreat groups, scholarships, different kind of pedagogical forms to address these things. Some things still say the same. And so, what are some of the deeper structures? Like who defines the Dharma? How is it going to be practiced? These often remain intact. So there's this kind of consensus understanding of the Dharma that stays intact. And I explore in the project how these institutions maintain the stability of that consensus framing, particularly through the role of teachers, and how spiritual authority and teachers intersect and dovetail with the um, continuation and reproduction of whiteness in these institutions.
Excellent. Well, it's an anthropology book. I usually work with religious studies scholars in this particular podcast, so this might be a little different. I'm curious. Tell me a little bit about the methods
Yeah.
you've been using for the research and for the study itself.
So it's been an ongoing exploration for me as well, and I've actually been experimenting with new methodologies for me. As you said, I am an anthropologist, and so for an anthropologist, our primary means of doing field work and research is interviews and what's called participant observation. So, and as you call it, deep hanging out in the communities, in their everyday lives. I started this research, this particular book project, although I had done field work prime before to start this work in 2020. So my funding for this project started right in the pandemic. And so this was a Zoom landscape that I was operating rather than using my funding to go and do field research in the different insight communities. I was primarily doing it on interviews. So I collected 46 interviews with both practitioners of color as well as white practitioners, um, teachers, volunteers, activists, board members, longtime practitioners who started in the 70s, who just started out in the last, 5 to 10 years. In that way, it was so. One of the things that I found myself doing was doing an oral history project of institutions. So it was in a way like a biography of diversity, inclusion, and equity work in insight communities, rather than doing participant observation in the sense of like being inside the organization as a volunteer or a leader. I was talking to the people as they did it in the 70s, as they were doing it in the 80s and the 90s, and actually seeing these repeated patterns and themes. So my methodology was somewhat different to an anthropologist who would be doing participant observation on an ongoing basis. But I probably would not if I had done that. When I have participated in retreats, but retreats are really silent retreats. So other than my own experience and maybe side conversations I would have or talking to people outside of it, there isn't really a capacity to look at how the institution, what's going on in the background, in the scene over time, what are the patterns, what's happening in the boardrooms. Those conversations I could only hear from talking to people who've been doing that work in different contexts.
Excellent. So, when I was looking at some of the materials around your book, I noticed some particular objectives. First, to facilitate learning and offer resources for communities. And two, to help others build inclusive communities. So, like using what communities do and then kind of spreading that out to other communities is kind of what I'm getting from that. Can you tell listeners a little bit about some tentative findings related to these objectives?
Yeah. One of the things that really struck out to me is the parallels that on one degree are between the advocacy work and the much of the labor that went and has been ongoing in these communities, uh, in insight meditation in American Buddhist communities to a secular organization like the education context, like teachers and professors working in higher education. So there's often a focus on increasing the representation of teachers of color, changing the pedagogy, changing introducing various ways of addressing the Dharma in the curriculum. So there's a lot of similarities that I found between these contexts. But what was really striking for me is, and the way, so what I mean by that is how faculty of color have been really informed by the civil rights movement and things like that history of racial justice work in the United States have been working to address issues of racism and whiteness in the context of the university and how subjects have been framed and curriculum has been framed by these implicit assumptions. But what's really interesting for me was how spiritual authority makes this distinct from the secular organizations that are similar, and how teacher authority and how epistemic authority around what the Dharma means, or how the Pali Canon is drawn on, how linkage to teachers' lineage with Asian teachers, how those forms of authority get drawn on in ways that are actually much more difficult to change than secular context. And another interesting factor that's related to that is a key. So there are these ways in which North American Buddhism, convert Buddhism, has been described and defined in the scholarship. Is that in addition to the part of the some of the tropes of modernism that it's described as is that it's also democratized because they're lay-based, they're egalitarian because they have moved away from the monastic structures, that these are lay-based communities in which there's a democratized form of power and that there's equality between people as a result because there is no longer the monastic sanghas and spiritual authority of the sangha that's playing out. But what I really found out through listening to the activist and them coming up against the institution and the various different efforts that they did and the different kind of brick walls that they came up against is how the organizations are far from democratic, that there's actually a hierarchical structure, that there are teachers in charge who are determining and who are supporting uh, various ways in which the Dharma is going to be talked about. And a lot of the efforts of practitioners of color is trying to galvanize uh, the senior teachers to advocate for their programs. So that really resurfaces some of the very non-democratic ways in which these organizations work. Although they often have boards, the teachers have they have close ties to the board members and as students. So often the board members are the students of the teachers, so that there's this kind of like extension of their power beyond their teacher role. So some of the things that so these are some of the interesting findings that I'm exploring through this book project.
Wonderful. What are some specific accomplishments of your participants that you feel could be passed on nicely to other Buddhist or spiritual organizations? What are some things that they've accomplished that you're like, oh, that would go well with many other communities?
Yeah, there's three key approaches that I have identified. Actually, say, I'm going to go back.
All good.
There are 3 to 5 key uh, tactics and strategies that I have found have been the most effective. And how they get played out depends on the institution's ability to respond to those changes. Um, at the most basic level is organize when and this often comes not over a one-time effort. It is comes with the challenge of doing this over decades. So there's often a rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And so I'm going to say that as a caveat because there is a lot of labor and emotional labor and burnout that comes in the process of the success of these strategies. So I hold both those things together in saying this. That said, I would say that first, there's the awareness raising efforts where practitioners are talking to the community about the issues and the problems of access and alienation that they're feeling. So speaking with their teachers, speaking with the staff, speaking with their fellow practitioners, having these conversations through consultations, through one-on-one conversations during and off retreat. So that's kind of the basic level. And then the second is creating a safe and inclusive refuge spaces. So having BIPOC retreats have been really important for communities, so that practitioners can come together and explore the Dharma in ways that are meaningful and which are addressing the problems of structural racism in a collective way rather than an individual way, so that you can engage the Dharma in ways that are not just seeing how it is me that it is my suffering, but this is a collective experience, and how we can explore the Dharma collectively, and how racialized suffering is a means of understanding the Dharma. So I think inclusive refuge spaces has been an important piece that has been replicated, and you now see that as once a tactic that has been widely adopted quite successfully. Um, then sometimes the more challenging thing is addressing changing the pedagogical format, increasing the leadership of teachers of color. So that is a pipeline. So it starts from creating these safe spaces, but then also giving them, providing before teacher training, there's leadership development. There are networks that you're building, and those take a long time to build. And then eventually, also convincing the communities the inside communities that they need a leadership training in which there are more teachers of color that are going to be graduated. And this can be quite a, just like in the university, just like we're seeing in higher education of like, this is a affirmative action is not is reverse racism. These kinds of questions are teachers of color really are they really skilled? Are they really understanding the Dharma? These kinds of pushback comes up. And so you have to go through these challenges, have the board approve it, have the institution be able to provide the funding for that, be willing to receive donations and philanthropic funding to shift how they're going to be teaching. So these are really challenging things, but these are also what actually makes the structural change happen. And it's it's a back and forth process that, one of my interlocutors described it as a Sisyphean task because it's like pushing the boulder and then you keep going back and you keep going forward. And so and then the other part that they say is that because there's a burnout, there's one person doing the work for a few years and then you have to have somebody else follow you to take it on and keep going. So I say these are kind of the lessons learned that can be applied, but it's not so easily applied.
Mm. What are some of your favorite experiences that you had during the research process? Or were there any like cool moments or stories that stand out to you while you're doing this that really just kind of jump out at you as being something memorable and fun?
Um, I would say for me, I don't know if it was fun so much as it was meaningful and interesting to me to do this research as an anthropologist because I am a person of color. But I'm also coming into these communities not necessarily as a learning Buddhism. Like I'm not coming as a convert Buddhism. I was born and raised in a Buddhist household. So in an anthropologist, you're kind of navigating this outsider insider experience and contrast to my research in Sri Lanka, where I was actually, doing research in Sri Lanka as a Sinhala Buddhist person, talking to other Sinhalese Buddhists here in in the United States. I've been finding myself navigating this interesting this interesting context in which I am an outsider in that I am not a meditation practitioner. I do not do Vipassana regularly, and it's not a part of my way of engaging as a Buddhist. But at the same time, I'm also a person of color who's experiencing these issues of racial othering in the United States. So that was really rewarding for me to sit in that not binary, in that insider outsider role.
Hmm. What's the timeline for the book project? Where's it at in the process right now?
Yeah, so right now I have an advanced contract with Rutgers University Press. And the chap book is about three-fourths written, and I have the plans are to get it done next year, by early next year, to have the book submitted and sent out to peer review.
What other projects are you working on? What are you excited about at the moment?
Yeah, right now, as I said, I'm an independent scholar, so I have a lot of academia as my side hustle.
Hmm.
Many academics have side hustles, they do other things, but academia is my side hustle. So, one of the things that I'm excited about is a handbook, a Bloomsbury Handbook on Buddhism and Women, that I am a co-editor with Emma Tomalin, Sharon Suh, Caroline Starkey, and Bayan Ding. And it's a three-part volume, which the first part focuses on the lived experiences of Buddhist women, and they're co-authored between scholars and interlocutors. So each chapter focuses on the experience of a Buddhist woman from a particular country, in the United States, Sri Lanka, Burma, Vietnam, Latin America, various different parts of the world. And then the second part is a set of chapters that are approaching Buddhism and women from a methodological, theoretical standpoint. That is a resource for scholars studying Buddhism and gender. And the third part is looking at issues and themes that are important in the experiences of women in Buddhism. So that it's going to be like 28 to 32 chapters. It's a mega volume, and it's really exciting to work on it together with these other incredible scholars.
Excellent. I know that you're also a part of the Sacred Rites Templeton Working Group. Tell me a little bit about what that experience was like.
Yeah, that has been incredible because it's been an opportunity to work with scholars and friends who are interested in similar questions around how religious traditions and texts and practices are adopted in various different ways. In my case, looking at meditation, but you've spoken to people like Ira, Ann Gleig, Susanna, Natalie. All these people are looking at various ways in which religion has been adopted in different spheres, and what are the ethics of exploring those questions. For me, myself and Ann Glegg have been collaborating on a project in the Sacred Rites project is on Buddhism in Hawaii. For both of us, we are stepping into a new field site. Both of our work has been primarily on the mainland on American Buddhism here, and Hawaii does have the largest Buddhist population in the United States and has had actually a very a long Buddhist history, especially because of the immigrant uh, Japanese, Chinese populations that have been on the island for a long time, but also people like Mary Foster, who I wrote about recently. She was an indigenous white woman who was practicing Buddhism in the early 1900s, interested in theosophy. So we are both exploring new projects in Buddhism in Hawaii, building on the work of other great scholars who've already been doing this work, like Jeff Wilson.
Excellent. Well, I lived in Hawaii for a while, so I would love to know more about that project in the future. Perhaps I can get you and Dr. Glag on here together for a joint conversation sometime in the not too distant future. Would
Yeah,
you
that would
all be
be
down
fun.
for that?
That would be fun.
Wonderful. Well, Nalika, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It has been a delight to learn about your project, Transforming the American Sangha. I look forward to seeing the book and seeing what comes of it. And then perhaps whenever the book comes out and is officially released, we can get you on for a part two. Where can
That'd
people
be great.
find you? Yeah, where can people find you if they want to follow along with the project in the works?
I have a website, nalikagajawira.com, that is under construction. But currently, most of my work is on academia.edu, although I am trying to shift away from that platform. That's why I'm building a website. I think if you Google me, there's a bunch of my articles and publications out there. I've written for the Journal of Global Buddhism. I have a piece in Anthropology Today. I have some things on Tricycle, on Lion's Roar, and a recent book with Sharon So on Emergent Dharma on Asian American feminist voices. So my work is kind of all over the place, but those are some of the places you can find me.
Well, listeners can find the link to your website in the show notes in their podcast app. Dr. Nalika Gajawira, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's been great talking to you and sharing about my work. I appreciate this opportunity.